In chapter 17 of your book, The Fight Against Monsanto's Roundup, what did you mean by genetic engineering, pesticides, and resistance to the new colonialism?
Genetic engineering is used as part of U.S. policy toward other countries, part of the empire, to kick people off their land, put genetically engineered crops onto that land for export, and then send those people who were kicked off the land, which is hundreds of thousands of people we're talking about, into export zones. Or this is part of the International Monetary Fund's structural adjustment program. So after the U.S. went into Somalia, for example, one of the outcomes of that was the mandated planting by the U.S., who supposedly went in there just for beneficial reasons, even though it was nonsense, to plant genetically engineered cassava all across that region of Africa, which before had no genetically engineered crops at all, and it helps take over not only the land, but the market, monocrops. It changes the whole character of communities that were reliant and on the former way of growing things. Corn in Mexico is another good example, how it takes over it dispossesses the communities which were built around a certain way of being connected to the land, and just produces things for a market, and it uproots those people. So it not only takes over their land, but it takes the people, and then they are uprooted. They come to the United States across the border. You want people to stop coming to the United States from Mexico across the border, stop, destroying their lives in Mexico. And so that's part of it. Henry Kissinger famously said, to give food aid to a country just because they are starving is a pretty weak reason. And I think about that. To give food aid to a country just because they are starving is a pretty weak reason. How immoral, but also how correct about what the U.S. policy is, that he helped design, of course. Give food as a weapon. Use food as a weapon is Henry Kissinger's idea. To use it because, people are desperate for food once they're dispossessed from their land, to do what they need to do to get food. And that includes planting genetically engineered seeds, which they're not allowed to plant the seeds of, even if it was okay. So after the first round of bombing of Iraq, the Bremer had an edict. Bremer was sort of the viceroy of Iraq that was appointed by the U.S. And he had edict number 81, in which it mandated that they have to not allow genetically engineered crops, which were mandated to be used, to be replanted, the seeds to be replanted. So here we have farmers who normally replant the seeds every year, who, it's part of a culture, a way of doing things. You have big festivals around harvest and planting, and now they're not allowed to plant the seeds that they grew from the previous crop, so that Monsanto or whoever owns it can make money from it. And it's not only making money, but it's taking over, serving other purposes too, in terms of empire. And so he mandated this. This was an edict. And this is a typical thing that's in the IMF structural adjustment, which I started talking about before, structural adjustment SAPs, they're called, projects or programs, and that they have to allow genetically engineered crops to be planted and imported. And there are only now seven countries in the entire world that have said no to that. And the two that come to mind right now, or I know all 7 of them, I've listed them, is Venezuela under Hugo Chavez, who banned genetic engineering from Venezuela. Yay, Hugo. And also Vladimir Putin in Russia. I said, what? Who thinks of Putin that way? What do you mean you're banning genetically engineered? You would think that all he does is sends people to mess up U.S. elections, right? Well, whatever one thinks of that, and I don't believe that that's true anyway, but that's too much of a simplification. They banned genetically. I had people, so in the book, I had my friends who speak fluent Russian go back through the Russian newspapers because I wanted to know if this is true or not. I didn't want to be just propagandized and then it's not true. And we went through the original Russian newspapers, and just like 3 or 4 years, it's recent. And they did. The Russian parliament, the equivalent, the Diet, and whatever else. It's interesting. It's called the Diet when we're talking about food. But they banned the planting of genetically engineered crops, and are promoting organic in huge areas. And, why? Do they really think it's healthier? I don't know. Maybe they want to compete with the U.S. market in Europe or somewhere else which doesn't want the U.S. In Europe they were rejecting U.S. crops, especially soy and corn, because it's genetically engineered and saturated with spray. And if they have a built-in market then elsewhere, so they have an export crop that they could use to take over, where they have a huge supplier of wheat and in Russia. So that's part of what I meant by that. Needs to be, try to put it into a larger context to understand why it is that all these leaders around the world know about the dangers of Roundup. They know it. They've known it for years. We've protested for years. There was millions against Monsanto marches every year, and yet they still continue it. It's like continuing the spraying in New York, even though they know it. Why are they continuing? So part of the reason why is because they're leaned on as part of the IMF and U.S. policy that if you want to get grants from the IMF, you have to allow crops, genetically engineered crops, to be planted there or imported. And so all of the U.S. aid that goes to foreign countries, an earthquake in Puerto Rico or the tsunami in the South Pacific, all of that aid was genetically engineered grains and crops. And when we pointed this out to people in Africa, in Zambia, was it Zambia or I'm not sure which country, Gambia or Zambia. I'm mixing them up right now, sorry. But they were in Seattle. The delegation was in Seattle in 1999, as was I, as was most of the people involved in the anti-genetic engineering movement. And this is for the World Trade Organization, which turned into well-known protests, tear gas, arrests. It was quite a scene. And we met consistently with the people from Africa. Michael Hansen of Consumer Reports, Consumer Union, met with them, and I did. And not only, I played a minor role there, but a lot of people met together. And they didn't know, because it was fairly new at that time, about the dangers of this technology. I mean, even in Cuba in 1992, which is a long time, I had this huge argument. I was there visiting for the first time, and I had this huge argument at a biotech conference in Cuba with these scientists and my translators were going crazy, like trying to deal with the yelling. But they just didn't know. They never heard this stuff before. And because it was kept from them, because it was Monsanto, and they kept everything secret.